Welcome to day number 10. And Peter, we're on this 60-day journey through all of Paul's letters, and we find ourselves in the last chapter of the book of Romans. And in there, it gets very personal. There's a lot of stuff happening. And so Paul uploads to us some of his plans. So Peter, what are his plans? What is he looking to do? And it's kind of fascinating, actually.
Well, sometimes I think we think of St. Paul as a saint. And that's true, but saints have plans. And so in chapter 16, we get this toss away in verse 28 that he will, I will leave for Spain by way of you. And I love that verse, which I know sounds a little bit like odd of a verse to love, but because I think it just kind of reminds us of the humanness of Paul and what he's doing. You know, like he's trying to plan out his ministry. He's trying to like see it go somewhere. He goes that he's going to Spanion by way of Rome. So even Paul's Christian love thinks like, if I got to Rome, I could get to Spain. There's a little bit of like planning going on.
Yeah, exactly.
And Paul was an intense guy who often said like, I only think of Christ and Christ crucified. I don't think he's lying. But his life also has this stuff. And then I think we also get reminders of that as we move back into chapter 16, because we see all of these people that Paul wants to greet. And it reminds us that Paul, again, was a real person with real relationships. One way you might think about it is like a network. Like Paul had this network of relationships, and he had never been to Rome. So these are all people he had to kind of like know or connect with kind of elsewhere. So as the letter closes down, we get this fantastic reminder.
We almost get a look into his Rolodex and what he thinks about these people personally.
Oh, for sure.
And you know, my eye drops down to verse 6, where he says, greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. And, we've got this favorite preacher that we love to listen to. His name's Fred Craddock. And in one of his sermons, he talks about how in the Bible there are no lists. These are real people. And he comes to Mary, and he describes Mary as this woman that when Paul's done preaching, she says, now you go home, Paul. I'll lock up. I'll clean. I'll do all the stuff. And anyhow, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that these aren't just lists. These are real people who are following Jesus. And Paul, I think in some ways, Peter, is mentoring us right now about the importance of relationships, the importance of staying in touch with people. And as you've referenced before, and we just said in preparation for this video, this letter cost him $2,000. This isn't a text. I mean, Paul is literally going through the people he knows, and he's mentoring us and pastoring us in the importance of relationship, staying in touch with people, which we can do so easily now. Back then, it was $2,000 for him to send this or thereabouts, right?
Yeah, in verse 22 of chapter 16, we get that phrase, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. And so what we're assuming is Paul paid a scribe to kind of take down what he's saying. A lot of people assume that because there are hints in Paul's letters that he's gone blind as he's got older. So in Galatians, he'll say, like, I write this to you with my own hand, which is meant to sort of like say something. But we've got this immensely human Paul, and then he closes with this blessing. To the only wise God be glory forevermore through Jesus Christ. Amen.
Well, one thought that I have here, Peter, that I think is at least interesting in the sense of we're going to look at all Paul's letters. We see in verse 21, Paul mentions Timothy, his co-worker in the faith. And we're going to discover in not too long that Paul actually writes 2 letters to Timothy to encourage him. And so Timothy's kind of Paul's understudy, his protege in the faith, pastorally. He's mentoring him and raising him up. I think it's interesting here in Romans, he mentions him, and then again, in not too long, we're going to read 2 letters that Paul wrote to him personally. Any other thoughts that come to mind before we close out our time?
Well, as we're closing Romans, I guess, there's kind of like some big thoughts to close out with. I think one of the things, as we come to Romans and we ask, how is this supposed to change how we do church life at City Church, or if you're one of the people who doesn't go to City Church and watch these videos in your own church community, I think we have this big question of what are we supposed to do with the Jew-Gentile divide.
Yes.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer was an important theologian of the 20th century and sort of my best dead friend. Has a famous letter called the Letter on Christianity, sometimes called the Letter on Christianity Without Religion, in which Bonhoeffer wonders whether there are things like circumcision that have been imposed on Christians that they need to be or do in order to really be Christian. And his argument is it's religion, that the modern category of religion, you have to be religious in order to be Christian. You know, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in that idea, but one of the ways I might want to push back a little bit on Bonhoeffer, even if I kind of agree with him, is I sort of don't think the Jew-Gentile divide is like a metaphor to be taken from Romans, and then we look around in our own culture and we go, where do we have divides?
What do we cherry pick to fill in?
Well, we'll do it sort of like, the sense would be that the Jew-Gentile divide is basically unrelated, actually, to what we do. But we just use it as a model for sorting out
how to deal with other things, yes.
But in actual fact, I really do think that the racial questions we live with are so close to what we see in the Jew-Gentile divide that Romans is dealing with, that Galatians will deal with, that the advice about it is almost direct. I mean, here you have one group of people who have a long history of understanding themselves to be ethnically, culturally, the locus of God's action. And they are starting to see other people who are ethnically, culturally beyond them brought in. And when they bring them in, they're trying to say, you've got to look like us first.
Circumcision, all that stuff.
And if you get sort of into the nitty-gritty of race in America in the early days, we see this very similar thing where by the 17th century, you have Brits, for instance, or the French or the German, who believe to be French or German or British is to be Christian, and vice versa. If you're German, you're Lutheran. If you're British, you're Church of England. It's just who you are. And so when they engage these other people that are ethnically and culturally different than them, the Native Americans,
the
enslaved Africans, they think they've got to be British in order to be Christian. In the same way some people are saying, you've got to be Jewish in order to be Christian. Now, I think on the one hand, what they've totally forgotten is they're the Gentiles who have been grafted in. If anybody actually had a shot at that argument, it would be the actual people of Israel. And so it's in fact when you make it a metaphor, when you don't allow Israel to be historic Israel, that you start to think like, well, Israel simply equals church, which simply equals my country, which the logic kind of flows the same way.
And it's easy to do.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Well, it's a lot better if in order to be Christian, someone has to be your culture, because then you don't ever have to change. Like you become the mark of holiness, and you have to conform to me in order to conform to Jesus. And so what the history of race in America, as far as I can tell, is basically identical to this problem. It's just that we made this other category called race, which historians would argue, or at least the ones I know, comes into being in the kind of across the 16th to 18th century. It comes into being and it takes on so much of the stuff that's being debated here about whether ethnic background and theological status and moral status and cultural background, those are all bound up together.
And what it means to be human?
Yeah, totally.
All of that stuff.
I think as we hear this Jew-Gentile divide, one thing, it's difficult for me to understand how we would read this and we couldn't come around to saying, the fact that in America, it is statistically pretty uncommon that people of different races worship together in communities that reflect both of them strongly. That is a serious challenge to the idea that we are living the church as it's supposed to be. So if we do go to churches where people only look like us, it's hard, it can be maybe even without noticing it a little bit, we're sort of saying, well, you need to look like us in order to be Christian. So I think one spiritual discipline that we can take on, not to send people away from their churches, but one spiritual discipline we can take on is, what if we're intentional in some ways about worshiping with people who are not like us? I got challenged by a professor one summer only to go to non-white churches for the summer. So I went to some National Baptist churches and a Greek Orthodox church, and I had this experience that I haven't had before of feeling uncomfortable in church.
Yes.
Even when, and I had to go like, okay, this uncomfortability doesn't mean I or they're doing anything wrong per se, but wow, a lot of people must feel this way in my church.
Yeah. Well, Peter, our time is now up, and I think a neat way to close out this conversation would be to read his benediction, his following prayer. And so I'm going to go ahead and read that, and we'll use that as our exiting prayer. So here's what Paul writes. Now to him who is able to establish you in accordance with my gospel, the message I proclaim about Jesus Christ, in keeping with the revelation of the mystery hidden for long ages past, but now revealed and made known through the prophetic writings by the command of the eternal God, so that all Gentiles might come to the obedience that comes from faith, to the only wise God, be glory forever through Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, God bless you, and we look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's video.